The following is a land acknowledgement from A.R.T. New York. We would like to take this time to acknowledge that, wherever we're currently located on Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America, we are in occupied territory. A.R.T. New York's membership in the 5 boroughs of New York City operates on the unceded ancestral land of the Lenape, Wappinger, Canarsie, Rockaway, and Matinecock communities. We want to honor and celebrate all of these Indigenous communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. We also want to take this time to acknowledge that after there was stolen land, there were stolen people. We want to honor the generations of displaced and enslaved people that build and continue to build the country we occupy today. Since we are gathered today in virtual space, let's also take a moment to consider the legacies of colonization embedded within the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We're using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. We invite you to join us in acknowledging all of this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good of this time and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, anti-racism, and allyship. Thank you. The virtual part of the land acknowledgement was written by Adrian Wong of Spiderweb Show in Ontario, Canada. To learn more about whose land you are on, visit native-land.ca. Thank you.
Kirsten here. Welcome to our last module of the Disability 101 series. This module, we're going to look at anti-ableism and disability justice. On our screen, we have a red background with the title and subtitle, Disability 101, Anti-Ableism and Disability Justice in white text. And beneath that, in a white bar at the bottom of the screen, are the A.R.T. New York logo on the left and the MAC logo on the right. As I just said, we are in our last of 4 modules, looking at the basics of disability, talking about anti-ableism and disability justice. So what are our goals for this module? Today, we're going to learn about ableism. We're going to define it and share some examples of how it shows up both structurally in our society and interpersonally in our day-to-day interactions. We're going to discuss how it is not enough to just be accessible or quote-unquote inclusive. We must be anti-ableist. Additionally, anti-ableism is anti-racism and vice versa, and all oppressions are connected. And finally, we are going to share the 10 principles for disability justice created by SIN's Invalid. So let's dive in. What is ableism? For our purposes today, we are going to be looking at the working definition created by T.L. Lewis, updated January 2022, which was developed in community with disabled, Black, and other negatively racialized folks. But I'm just going to read this definition out loud, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. It's a lengthy definition, but it's a good one. So, ableism, a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, quote-unquote health or wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, quote-unquote excel, and quote-unquote behave. You don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. So that's a lot, and let's break it down. Ultimately, ableism is about value. It's about some people having value and some people not having value. And that value being tied to how people show up in society. It's about how they can produce up to the standards that capitalism imposes on us. It's about how their perceived intelligence, desirability, their fitness, and basically how well people adhere to what is structurally considered the norm. And in a society that prioritizes a certain white male cis able body, ableism impacts to varying degrees people who whose bodies and minds stray farther and farther from that norm. This definition highlights that ableism is something systemic, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, that it does show up in our interpersonal reactions or interpersonal interactions, but that it is something that affects the systems of the society that we live in. And something that I think is really interesting about this definition is the point that you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism, which is absolutely true. Ableism negatively impacts all of us, whether we're disabled or not. If someone perceives you as disabled, even if you're not, you can be, subject to ableism. And as we'll see with some of the examples, many of the ways that ableism shows up in the structures and systems of our society ultimately are harmful to everybody, whether you have a disability or not. So we'll start by talking about interpersonal ableism. So these are some ways that ableism shows up in the ways that we interact with each other. This is obviously far from a comprehensive list, but this is just meant to sort of get you thinking about different ways that you may have seen ableism show up, and help you understand some examples of the ways that disabled people often experience ableism in our day-to-day lives. One example of interpersonal ableism is the phrase, "You do not look disabled." Non-disabled people often say to people with non-apparent disabilities, thinking that it's a compliment, but sort of the meaning behind it is disability is something that I see as negative, and you look great or you look normal. So another thing we have on this list is viewing a person with a disability as inspirational or brave for doing typical things. This is another thing that non-disabled people might not think is ableist, that might come off as positive. And we talked a little bit about this in a previous module as well, because this is a common trope that comes up in storytelling about disability, as a disabled character being inspirational to non-disabled audiences. It sort of positions the disabled person as something other, something to be looked at, and not just as, an equal to the non-disabled person. Ableism also can show up interpersonally in questioning whether a person's disability is real or asking for proof of a disability. Assuming that somebody is faking their disability is only ever going to harm somebody who is disabled. Another big example of the way ableism shows up in interpersonal relationships is doubting a person's competence once you know they're disabled, especially if at first you didn't, and then your perception of somebody changes once you do know that maybe they're autistic or they have ADHD or some other kind of non-apparent disability, and now you think they can't do the thing that they have already shown you that they can do, which is something that I know happens a lot to people like myself with more non-apparent disabilities, especially in the workplace. And again, this is speaking to the idea that disabled people can't possibly do things to the standard that non-disabled people can. And so if somebody has a disability, they must not be able to do XYZ thing. Another way that interpersonal ableism shows up is when people are penalized for not conforming to unspoken rules of behavior. So this can show up in job interviews, in the workplace, and I think really relevant to us in theater audiences, where there are, sort of accepted, quote unquote, I'll say quote unquote accepted because accepted by sort of the dominant force, but accepted ways of how to behave in these environments, but those are often not explicitly stated. I would say they rarely are. And then people with different kinds of disabilities, and especially, I put this on here because it's a common autistic experience where you go into an environment where the rules are not made clear to you, and then you are punished or penalized or ostracized for not conforming to the rules that you were never told. And so I think a great way to combat this kind of ableism is to have fewer rules about especially the way that people are expected to behave, because people show up in the world in all different kinds of ways. And B, if there do have to be rules about certain kinds of things, that they are identified and explicitly stated. Structural ableism. And again, here we have a very non-comprehensive list, but these are just a few ways that valuing certain bodies and minds over others has informed the way that our society and our institutions are structured. A huge example of structural ableism in the workplace is the fact that in the vast majority of workplaces in the Western world, or at least in the US, I guess I'll be specific, have a limited amount of medical leave from work, and in some cases require a doctor's note to take a sick day. A lot of disabled people are going to need to take more sick days than non-disabled people for all different kinds of reasons. And so this means that, disabled people are disproportionately affected by the limited amount of sick days that we all have. That definition of ableism we looked at earlier, and how you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. This structural ableism harms all of us. Every person, whether you're disabled or not, is harmed by the fact that we have, in most workplaces, a limited amount of time that we can take off for being sick, because you can't control when you're sick, when your family members are sick and you have to care for them. Another huge example of structural ableism in this country is the way that public buildings, public transportations, and in particular, also private homes are designed without physical access. Only 6% of housing units in the entire United States are adequately accessible. I think looking specifically at theater industry, it's very common to build theaters with front of house access, but no back of house access, making this assumption that disabled people are welcome in our audiences. They're welcome to give us our money, but they can't perform on our stages. They can't design our shows, et cetera, et cetera. That's ableism. Another example of structural ableism that thankfully I think we've started to see some changes to over the past few years are non-essential requirements on job postings. So degree requirements, being able to lift a certain amount of weight to work in a mostly office job. I would recommend, if you are somebody who writes job postings, who writes casting calls, to really think about what is actually essential to somebody completing that job, and not automatically exclude disabled people with requirements that aren't actually required. Another example of the way ableism shows up in the structures of our society is requiring a phone call to access 911. if a disabled person who can't use a phone is having some kind of emergency, if that person is deaf, if that person is non-speaking, or any other number of reasons where they can't make a phone call, how are they going to access the emergency help that they need? And lastly, again, a very US specific problem, but the fact that insurance costs more if you have quote unquote pre-existing conditions, which is another euphemism for disabilities. We have something that's sort of colloquially known as the disability tax in this country, which means that almost everything is more expensive if you have a disability. These are all sorts of different ways that not just in our interpersonal relationships, but in the ways that our society is structured, that ableism shows up. And again, these are, for the most part, things that harm us, whether we have a disability or not. I did want to share, before passing it off to Ash, some activists that are doing or have done some really wonderful work in disability rights spaces, in disability justice spaces. So I encourage you to do your own research on some of these folks. I'm going to read off a list on the screen. Some of these folks are no longer with us. Some of them are still actively doing really excellent work. But some disability activists that you should know: Judy Heumann, Lois Curtis, Harriet McBride Johnson, Haben Girma, Mel Baggs, Stacy Milburn Park, Alice Swan, Lydia XZ Brown, Imani Barbarin, Rebecca Coakley, and Patty Byrne. With that, I will pass it off to Ash to share with us the 10 principles of disability justice.
Hello, everyone. Ash speaking, ready to take us forward with the 10 principles of disability justice created by SIN's Invalid. So this disability justice-based performance project incubates and celebrates artists with disabilities, and they centralize artists of color and LGBTQ/gender variant artists as communities who are historically marginalized. So over the next couple of slides, I'm going to take a closer look at each of these principles, and we will also provide a link directly to the website for SIN's Invalid in the description of this module. On this slide, we have all 10 principles listed out. I'm going to read them off. Number 1 is intersectionality. Number 2 is leadership of those most impacted. 3, anti-capitalism. 4, cross-movement solidarity. 5, wholeness. 6, sustainability. 7, cross-disability solidarity. 7, cross-disability solidarity. 8, interdependence. 9, collective access. And 10, collective liberation. So let's dive a little deeper into these 10 principles of disability justice, shall we? Number 1 is intersectionality. And under that is a quote that reads, "We do not live single issue lives," Audre Lorde. And under that is some further language that reads, "Ableism coupled with white supremacy, supported by capitalism, underscored by heteropatriarchy, has rendered the vast majority of the world invalid." Basically, what this means is all of these isms, ableism, racism, sexism, these phobias, homophobia, transphobia, they all feed into each other. There's an intersectionality of issues, and you can't address one without addressing the others. The second principle of disability justice is leadership of those most impacted. The quote under that reads, "We are led by those who most know these systems." And that is a quote by Aurora Levins Morales. The third principle of disability justice is anti-capitalist politic. In an economy that sees land and humans as components of profit, we are anti-capitalist by the nature of having non-conforming bodies and minds. In other words, just by having bodies and minds that don't conform to the status quo of society and the economy, we are anti-capitalist in nature. The fourth principle of disability justice is commitment to cross-movement organizing. And the language under that reads, shifting how social justice movements understand disability and contextualize ableism. Disability justice lends itself to politics of alliance. The fifth disability justice principle is recognizing wholeness. People have inherent worth outside of commodity relations and capitalist notions of productivity. Each person is full of history and life experiences. And what this basically means is we are more than what we produce. We are more than our productivity. We have value outside of how we contribute to this capitalist society that we, are forced to live in. Number 6 is sustainability. We pace ourselves individually and collectively to be sustained long term. Our embodied experiences guide us toward ongoing justice and liberation. Look, this work is not easy. There's a lot of emotional labor that goes into it, and change is not going to happen overnight. With all the policies and behaviors and structures that are in place in our society, it takes time. And so we have to pace ourselves, not just as individuals who are contributing to this work, but as a collective, in order to build long-lasting, sustainable change. Number 7 is commitment to cross-disability solidarity. We honor the insights and participation of all of our community members, knowing that isolation undermines collective liberation. Number 8 is interdependence. We meet each other's needs as we build toward liberation, knowing that state solutions inevitably extend into further control over our lives. The 9th principle of disability justice is collective access. As Brown, Black, and queer-bodied disabled people, we bring flexibility and creative nuance that go beyond able-bodied/minded normativity to be in community with each other. And the 10th principle of disability justice is collective liberation. No body or mind can be left behind. Only moving together can we accomplish the revolution we require. In other words, when one of us is liberated, all of us are liberated. No one body, no one mind can fall through the cracks. And we have to move together, continue supporting each other, meeting each other's needs, working together in order to accomplish, once again, the long-lasting change and revolution that we are aiming for. So on this slide, we just have a repeat of the 10 principles of disability justice created by SIN's Invalid. I'm going to go through those again. Number 1 is intersectionality. Number 2, leadership of those most impacted. Number 3, anti-capitalism. 4, cross-movement solidarity. 5, wholeness. 6, sustainability. 7, cross-disability solidarity. 8, interdependence. 9, collective access. And 10, collective liberation. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for tuning in to Disability 101, a 4-part module series developed by A.R.T. New York in collaboration with MAC. I would like to take this time to thank my co-facilitator, Kirsten Sweeney, for all of their hard work on this webinar. I have listed both of our contact information on this final slide. Again, thanks so much for watching.